Welcome back. Welcome, Gillian. Gillian's the next in our summer series of live learning, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with her today. We'll have some people join along the way, I'm sure. And Gillian has really unique work in terms of the approach and the research that she is conducting in education. I don't hear many other voices in the world of thought leadership that speak to the subject that you speak to. But before we do that, let's just have an introduction from you, Gillian. Some of your background. How did you start in all of this, and how did you get to where you are now?
Well, I began as a classroom teacher, a high school teacher. I knew I was in the right business. All facets of education really interest me. But I started my doctoral studies in imagination and the role of imagination in learning about 20 years ago now. Crazy. And so that is my work now. I do research on the role of imagination in K-12 education, post-secondary education, early years primary education, and increasingly, and for the last few years, on the role of imagination in leadership.
What was the pivotal moment that led you into exploring imagination as a dimension of learning and, in fact, of leadership?
It was my great pleasure to take a doctoral program with the late Kieran Egan, Dr. Kieran Egan at Simon Fraser University. And I got to study under him, and he really focused on how we engage learners and how we tap into the ways in which learners make sense of the world, the emotional meaning in the world, and how teaching is storytelling. So coming out of my high school teaching years, I knew those magic moments, but his theory and approach to teaching really explained why those moments were magical. So I studied the work. I did my own doctoral study, applied the role of imagination to ecological understanding. And so a lot of my practice has been around the role of imagination in cultivating a sense of connection to the natural world. But I've been doing a ton of teaching about Kieran's theory. I was very fortunate to work very closely with him for the last 15 years. And so it was sort of a confluence of factors, studying at Simon Fraser University, being interested in increasing the engagement in my own teaching, and then increasing interest in leadership is what's brought me to this topic in this course today, where imagination and leadership collide.
Yeah. I'm still interested in that trigger moment. Do you remember a time when you thought, no, this is a direction? Was there some sort of event, some sort of surprise, some sort of insight that led you in that first sort of deviation from regular classroom teaching into research? Was it reading Kieran's book or his work? What was it that triggered all of that?
It's interesting because I had sort of two things happening at once. One, I was a bit disillusioned with my teaching. I felt like I was going through the motions a lot of the time, and his theory on teaching as storytelling just fueled my fire as to how do we make teaching more engaging and enjoyable for students and teachers themselves. And then in addition to that, I was also deeply concerned about the natural world and concerned very much about the lack of emotional connection that I saw with my students with the natural world. And so when I was studying imagination and seeing that it is through imagination that we emotionally connect to things, I was curious about how then can we engage and leverage imagination to cultivate a sense of place and connection to natural communities. And so it was a parallel interest in engagement, not only with pedagogy and French language. I was a French teacher, but also how do we support the cultivation of something maybe called a sense of place in urban schools? And I think imagination is incredibly important to fulfill that goal.
I'd love you just to expand a little bit on that. How do you connect a sense of place with imagination? Because for some people that might be a bit of a stretch.
Well, we need to talk about what imagination is then, and I'm not sure if we want to jump right to that. But I know that a lot of people listening have misconceptions about what imagination is. I think that if you consider imagination to be, the work of very young children, of artists, fairy tales, make-believe, unicorns, and all of that, certainly if you Google images of imagination, you get all of those kinds of images. If you believe imagination is that, then you probably don't see how it's important for our everyday lives, how it's important for leadership, how it's important for caring about the natural world. I don't see imagination in that way. I think the fantasy side of imagination is one facet of imagination, but imagination is much more involved in our lives because we are emotional beings, and it's through emotional connection that we make sense of our environments, that we make sense of the world. So the connection is that if we want to care about anything, our imagination is woken up when we emotionally lean into topics.
So we're just getting some more people coming on now, and welcome for those people who are joining. We're just exploring Gillian's background and how she got here, and the sort of early exploration of imagination. If you could capture in your definition what you describe as imagination in that broader sense, how do you start to describe in a single sentence, if that's possible, this idea of imagination that you have that might challenge the existing sort of mental maps that people have?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the way you've just used imagination in your description, mental maps, you're throwing metaphors around. I mean, we do it all the time. But if I was going to define it in a way that made it much more sensible to include it in boardrooms and include it in teachers' colleges, is that imagination is the ability to envision the possible in all things. And it is out of imagination that creativity and innovation grow. And so we do tend to like to jump to creativity and let's be creative. But there is no creativity without that first ability to envision the possible. And there's a lot of research out there that indicates, certainly the work of Julian, Pendleton, and Brown, on the pragmatic imagination. Imagination is highly practical. It's involved in a range of cognitive abilities, from perception all the way through to that very speculative, experimental, and hypothesizing kind of thinking. Because imagination is what allows us to fill that gap between what is and what could be, or what is now and is what not, and what is not yet. So that all seems very theoretical, but nobody would understand stories if we couldn't envision another perspective, if we couldn't take on somebody else's perspective, if we couldn't notice patterns within information. These are all aspects of imagination that help us make sense of the world. So in the work I do on imaginative education, imaginative ecological education, and imaginative leadership, I'm really looking at how do we cultivate our ability to use the tools of imagination so that we're better at envisioning the possible.
It's really fascinating. And the one word that comes up when I'm listening to what you're saying is the word gap. It's almost like there's a creation of a gap. And you describe 3 gaps between now and what could be or what isn't. And there was a third one that I've missed. But that sense of a difference between where I am now and what a future state could be, based on that difference between how things are now and how they might be. And you've got a series of cognitive tools as well that I think some of these are, people may not realise that we use as every day, and this is in a part of the coursework that you do. But I'm interested to throw to one of the first questions, because you were keen to get us talking. If I put the question behind me, and if I just go back to my little app that can help me pop this up. In fact, here it is, this first one. So if I just move myself, love to hear from folk in, Craig, Irene, others. Feel free to come off mute or to throw into the chat. Given that we've got that we've heard from Gillian, that introduction, what is your understanding of imagination? So throwing to the group. If we don't get any responses, I'm going to pick someone out. Jen, actually, I might start. Oh, it looks like Irene was about to say something. Did you draw a breath, Irene? And welcome, by the way. Did you draw a breath as if you were going to say something just then? Or am I putting you on the spot? What would you think, now that I'm talking to you? What would you think? What is your perception, your understanding, your mental map at the moment, before we explore today, of imagination?
It's, oh my goodness, I'm like, oh.
Welcome. Fabulous, David.
Thank you.
It's a hard thing to define, Irene. It isn't easy to define.
Yeah.
So don't worry.
It's just interesting for me that you did say that there's no creativity without imagination. So that stuck with me, because it's like, it's true, because how can like it's like the first step the first of many, steps. And because I'm like thinking from the point of view of a young child, uh, like how I wonder how imagination, because imagination is reflected through pretend play with the children. They can be Elsa or they can be someone else, or they can be superheroes. Um, but then, like, uh, bringing the level up to leadership, it's like making me realize, just that the whole title of your session is making me realize we are still playing, and we are still using all these things that we teach the children to do, but then in a way that will hopefully be helpful and solve problems um, problems around us.
I love how you articulated that. It points to one of the misconceptions. One is that only certain people are imaginative. And another misconception is that once we're kids are more imaginative than adults. And it's the reverse. Now, people might object to that. But what grows imagination? Knowledge and experience. So imagination grows with knowledge and experience. We want students to learn as much as they can about the world if we're going to enable them to be as imaginative as possible. So when we think about leadership, we have to let go of the belief that imagination is only the make-believe play. It's actually the possibility making, the possibility finding that Pendleton, Julian, and Brown say is what we need to navigate a whitewater world. And as leaders, isn't every day that way? Or as Asma says, we have to navigate the world of improvisation. Our world is only partly in existence. The rest is made of what ifs and what could be's. And imagination is what enables us to navigate that, to deal with flexibly and adaptively with change. So it's switching our mindsets and in bringing imagination to the center of discourse and leadership that my work is here now in this program, but my other research projects and also a book that's coming out by Teachers College Press. It brings together some really cutting edge research by researchers of leadership, educational practitioners, and leaders themselves about how they employ imagination in their leadership practices and why we need to do so to create a socially just world and ecologically just world. So I love what you said there, and I agree with you. It's that the idea that how do we bring it up? My point is it's never gone away. We've just been conditioned to ignore it and downplay it. I have to say, we're obsessed with measuring things. We know that. We count what's countable. And that's a problem because not everything that is countable counts and not everything that isn't countable doesn't count, if that makes sense. So the things like imagination are hard to measure, much easier to measure the outcome, like a creative act or a project. But we need to get in there and understand how imagination works as the source of all that comes later.
Yeah, the big I've worked with you for a little while, and I love the new perspective or the reset of the perspective that we should have, rather than something that might be considered as new. But I love that. That's a new thought for me, that we become more imaginative with the more experience and the more knowledge we have, and that's a misconception I'd love to have broken apart a lot more. Welcome, Oscar and Miriam. We're just in this process of what is your understanding, what's your baseline currently of imagination, and feel free to jump in and contribute. Jen and Craig, maybe Jen, what is your thought before listening and before engaging with Gillian in the work that we do? What was your perception of imagination?
Well, it's kind of been blown out of the water in just these few minutes that we've been talking, because in my mind, I think like Gillian just said, I always thought my kids had the better imagination than me. And then as I've gotten into adulthood, my imagination has diminished, that I'm not as creative as my kids. And now hearing how you're talking through it and sharing it, and like, I forgot who just said it. I'm sorry. Irene, who said we are doing it. It is widening my perspective to, there are different ways I am using my imagination, but I guess in my mind, it was always that fantasy. Like I couldn't come up with the fantasy ideas or the stories. So my thinking has already shifted in these first 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
One of the problems, of course, is that we neglect imagination in schools. And imagination is universal, but it needs to be cultivated, needs to be developed. And also, so if we're thinking that imagination is just that fantasy make-believe, we might not do as much of that, but we're doing all the other things that imagination contributes to human being and to culture.
I'm just going to jump in here as well. I'm in the middle of a shopping mall here in New Zealand with my kids. I've just been to a movie, and I'm actually sitting here listening to this, Gillian, and I'm thinking, you know, Irene, those that don't know, I put it in the chat, but Irene actually taught my daughter Ella, who's now 8, when she was in nursery. And, you know, when I think about imagination, I wonder, you know, I look at her and I think, what is it that inspires her to do what she does? And I love the intersection of imagination with inquiry in particular, and how she engages with the world around her, how she interacts, engages. And Irene, you did that for her. You, whether you know it or not, as a teacher, you gave her that sense of imagination, curiosity, inquiry. You took her outside and let her explore and play with things around her, and that whole play-based idea of where imagination sits inside our curriculum, I think, is often lost. And I think it's also often lost in us as educators and adults as well. We often lose that sense of imagination and curiosity. So, you know, sort of my 2 cents there, I sort of pulled a few ideas together, but that's sort of where my mind took me as I was listening to this.
Thank you, Craig. I think what you're alluding to is, I mean, my sense of imagination is very much tied to a sociocultural view of education. And that is that we make sense of the world through tools. An example of a tool is a story. And this is what connects my conception of imagination to Lev Vygotsky's work, who says our intellectual development, the development of imagination, it happens through tools that help us mediate the world. Tools like metaphor, tools like vivid imagery. These are the cognitive tools that Andrew mentioned. These are tools of imagination that we can employ vividly and actively in our teaching. Sounds like Irene does that by having the students grow and engage their imaginations all the time. And as an educator, she mediates their use of those tools. And in so doing, grows imagination.
Yeah, fabulous and really good live example, Craig. Just an invitation, maybe Oscar and Miriam, we might drop across to the next question just to sort of keep the conversation going. Just to draw that line, maybe the gap might be too big, because for me there's a question around why is it that we lose touch with imagination through the later years of education, middle to later years, so that as adults we've been conditioned to ignore it. And in saying that, I love the idea of ignoring it because it's always there. And I think we're often using it without knowing that we're using it. And therefore we don't tactically or strategically or intentionally use the opportunity that sits in imagination. Do you want to frame this idea further about that gap before we get into this idea of imagination in leadership?
The gap, well, there may or may not be a gap, because imagination, how do I frame it this way? I think it might be a good time for me to introduce the unusual things I was going to say. My plan was to have three questions, 2 unusual things, and 1 hope. And so we're looking at the questions, but the 2 unusual things I wanted to introduce have to do with how I'm encouraging you to think about imagination. And I need you to hear me out. It's a bit different. We already talked about imagination being up in the sky with glitter and butterflies, but I'd like you to think about imagination more like soil. So life depends on soil. Soil comes first, and it's the same for imagination. We picture soil, the plants grow out of that soil. Well, same as imagination. Creativity comes out of that. Also, we know that soil is contextual, different properties, different capacities, different levels of fertility, depending on the area. Same for imagination. Imagination thrives, grows, and is more fertile depending on the context. We reap what we sow. Also, soil underlies us all. Sure, we might have concrete underneath us, but originally there was a lot of soil beneath us. And similarly, soil is imagination is universal. It underlies each of us individually. It underlies us universally because it is at the heart of all the stories that connect us, that help us make sense of ourselves, that help us make sense of our cultures. And fourthly, just like soil, you can increase it by cultivating it. Similarly with imagination, we can cultivate it, we can grow our imagination with tools. None of those ideas of imagination are captured when you look at a rainbow with a butterfly glittering next to a unicorn, right? So that's the first unusual thing. I'd like you to think about imagination as soil. We need to bring imagination down to earth. And that's what I'm trying to do in this EduSpark course and my other work, is how do we do that? And this is the second part, because we tend to think of imagination as untethered. Anything's possible. Well, actually, we have sets of very specific tools we can use to develop and grow imagination. And I saw that Craig put in the chat, what does that mean for a new leader starting out a school year? Well, there are sets of tools we can use to fulfill powerful functions of imagination in leadership. I think I'd like to say there's 4 major functions of imagination. So keeping up with our soil metaphor, what does imagination yield? 1, it allows us to understand what is for ourselves and what is for the other. It allows us to empathize. It enables us to envision what could be. It enables us to build and support ethical and equitable communities. And it enables us to communicate in meaningful and memorable ways. And that is the power of story, which doesn't function without imagination. So there's different capacities that come out of imagination. It can feel very daunting, but not, and this is the second unusual part, there's actually tools. There's tools we can employ in our leadership to develop those particular capacities as leaders, all of which we know we need to draw on throughout a day rather rapidly. So back to your question, Andrew, about the gap. I think that is what these cognitive tools do. They are the way of bridging the gap between what we know and what we don't know. And the power of a tool like a story or a vivid imagery or a game or a drama or a heroic quality or anomaly or sense of agency, these are all the tools I describe in the course, is that they tie up emotion, imagination, and knowledge. So when you use a cognitive tool to do anything, it becomes more meaningful and memorable. So we're drawing on that effective neuroscience understanding that there is no learning without emotional engagement. And there is no imagination without emotion. So by using imagination in our learning, by using imagination as leaders in the way we communicate to people in our schools and communities, so demonstrating for our teachers the instructional facets of teaching for imagination and building their capacity to engage their students with imagination. We're really cultivating communities of that make creativity and innovation possible in schools. So it's cognitive tools that bridge the gap, and it's cognitive tools that we need to talk about when we talk about imagination and leadership.
I've got a couple of other thoughts that I'll put on hold because I just want to throw to Oscar, Miriam, Craig, Irene, the whole group, any other responses to either a pre-existing or a shifting attitude towards imagination in leadership, just from the group. This is where I tactically use silence to draw someone out of.
It's a chatty bunch, isn't it?
Yes, it's often the case.
I was going to say that, sometimes it feels non-concrete, non-tangible, right? When you talk about imagination, like you were talking about before, things are how you can't always be measured. But to hear you talk about like that there are specific strategies that we can use does make it feel a little more tangible and a little more like, oh, well, if we have these tools, then like, I know this is the point you're trying to make, but this is the aha for me that we do all still have it and we can still use specific strategies and resources to cultivate it and grow it. So I think that's one of the big ahas I'm having as you're sharing.
And it's an aha I had too, Jennifer, because when I went into first studying imagination in pedagogy, I was a teacher and I had those lessons that were magical and I had those ones that like, let's just not talk about those. And I wanted to know what the difference was. And then I realized that I have the capacity to do this. And there's actual practical ways I can make imagination more central to all of the lessons and units I develop and support my students in growing it. And so when I came to that realization early in my career, it helped me realize later in my career that as a leader, and I've served in a few leadership positions, I'm using these cognitive tools. They're not just for teaching, they're tools of culture. I'm using the same tools in my own leadership. And so that's what this course is about. That's what this research book is about. This is what some of my other publications are about, is let's begin to use the language of imagination. Let's begin to talk about how to use the tools. And let's create, I have a collection of stories that's building of leaders who are not unwilling to use the language, because you have to be brave. You have to be brave. Research shows that there's a lot of mixed emotions about imagination and leadership, and that's where the second question comes from. Many people fear it and revere it at the same time. We value it in others, but we worry about doing it ourselves because we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to push for something that doesn't exist yet. It's much easier to live with the status quo. However, the world is literally on fire. We can't live with the status quo. We need to make radical changes to make a socially and ecologically just world. And we're not going to get there without envisioning what's possible and pushing in that direction. And my sense is we're not going to be able to do that as leaders without building a community where we're all willing to talk about imagination in our practice.
That leads
I'm
me. Look, this is work that I think just needs to be much more visible to education broadly. And the question that's arising for me now, because I do tend to think in gaps between what's present now and what we could do, and there's one that's appearing for me now, draws back to Craig's question. So I'm a new leader in a school, or I'm a leader with maybe a need for a new perspective to bring to people. Clearly there's an education process that a leader or a leadership should make so that everyone has a common understanding of what you're saying. So what are the steps that someone might take as a leader to start to rewire the culture of a school to be much more intentional about the use of imagination and its need for a place in an organization?
Mm-hmm. Because if I'm hearing you, there is an unlearning process that needs to happen. Because if we've come to this meeting with some conceptions of imagination, I did as well, then we have schools are full of people with conceptions that need to be unlearned. So how do we do that? Well, an imaginative school, a school that, I'm not saying that every aspect is not yet seen, but I'm talking about imagination, a culture that puts imagination at the center, values it, works for it, supports it. That is a relational environment. Because where would this kind of approach to leadership fit? It would fit firmly within relational leadership theory. That idea that we're connected through our stories, our shared ideas, but none of that works unless we have that strong respect and trust among the people in the community. So if I was a leader wanting to make some changes in my school regarding imagination, one, I'd need to do some critical self-reflection about my own beliefs and values around imagination. I'd need to be willing to share that with the people in my community. I then need to help them unearth their presuppositions and misconceptions about imagination. I'd also need to walk the walk. So how am I talking about this topic to my teachers? Am I droning on, or are they learning about it in a way that is engaging them? And then you say, you're enjoying yourself. Surprise. I'm engaging your imagination. Use the tools you're talking about. I love to do that with my students here. Partway through the term, they're like, I say, are you enjoying it? Yeah, it's the best thing ever. And I said, why might that be? Because I'm using this cognitive tool, this cognitive tool, this cognitive tool. Oh, yes. So as far as I know, staff meetings can be a little bit dry. Certainly they are in Canada. Very nice example. How do we communicate ideas in even that format that becomes less dry, more meaningful? So our staff isn't just getting through them, but they might be leaning into the topics that are being discussed. And not because we're putting on a show. This is not about putting on a costume or putting on a play. It's the way we shape the information we're conveying. And that's why this work is so important, because Imagination does not require you to be an artist. It does not require you to put on a costume. None of that. It just is asking you to enhance those capacities that make you more engaging and memorable and meaningful to the people you work with. So those are a few steps. But I mean, if you're interested, I hope you take the course.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons for this conversation, is to draw people's attention to that. My mental maps are sort of really shifting and on the fly, I'm connecting to some things. And there are two things I want to connect your thoughts to. One is, it's about knowing. And when you know that people know you, particularly through your story and through your narrative, that's where the basis of relational leadership comes from, the effort it takes to know other people. And when someone experiences your knowing leadership, that they feel that you know them, and that you accept them unconditionally, and that you work with the things that float their boats, and you help them work through the things they struggle with. That's a part of that relational piece that is happening. The other concept that I want to throw into this is something I'm beginning to realise with the whole domain of leading learning. It's actually about the opportunity for someone to make meaning of the stuff that's going on in their head, the conversational structures. So I think in many ways that staff meeting that you spoke about, if one person is talking, lots of people are tuning out. They're not putting the cognitive effort into the meaning making, which might be connecting to the mechanisms of imagination. So I'm wondering if there are some almost, if dare I call it, facilitative skills that leaders need to learn to put people in the position where they have to do the work of the cognitive tools, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering, they're sort of maybe connected ideas but might seem to be separate to begin with. I'd love thoughts from the group around this idea of conversation and of knowing, but what are your thoughts immediately around that?
My answer would be yes.
Good answer. I like it.
Yeah, so I agree. We need to be able to use the tools that well, the thing is, and I just noticed one of the questions that came up that said if a leader doesn't have imagination, but every leader has imagination. Every human has imagination. I mean, if I asked you about your childhood, you tell me a story, and you wouldn't make something up, but I'd have a sense of if you had a good childhood, if you had a bad childhood. We shape things in terms of stories all the time. That is, we shape things to bring out their emotional force all the time. You can't do that without imagination. So maybe we have less focus on our imagination. We haven't worked on it lately, but I can't answer the question on if we don't have it, because we do have it. We just have to we just need to cultivate it. And so in reference to your question, Andrew, then yes, indeed, we have to be intentional about how we use the tools. And it begins by working with people that are using them. It begins by connecting with the community of leaders that are saying and discussing and sharing how they use cognitive tools to develop their own imaginations and to develop the imaginations of the people in their communities.
And so I think the development of a leader then is one of the dimensions of development is in fact this development of the tool of imagination, intentionally and deliberately and strategically. It's a part of the leadership dimension, isn't it, that we probably don't consider at this point?
It is. And one of my research projects is on leadership education. So we've developed and run a K-12 imaginative leadership cohort with a very particular pedagogy attached to that. And we're now interviewing the graduates of that program and looking at what facets of that program really help them re-envision what imagination means, change their conception of what it is and its role in their leadership. And then parallel to that, I've been experimenting with an arts-based approach to teaching about leadership concepts and how it impacts notions of leadership. So huge implications for leadership education, but not just formalized graduate programs. I'm also hoping to offer some professional development, a book club when the new book is released, and it would be also a form of professional development for leaders, working together to explore imagination individually and collectively.
Tell us a bit more about the book. You've mentioned it a few times, but I wanted to
sure.
Yeah,
if you
go for it, please. It's so exciting to see it happening. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of on the brain because I've just got the manuscript back and I'm reading through all the pages of it, and I'm just so excited about the chapters. So it's got 9 researchers who've contributed chapters on the role of imagination in leadership. And each section is started out by a practicing leader who describes in a story how they use imagination in leadership. And it's connected to an online collection of stories of how leaders are using imagination. And there's 3 sections. One is about how does imagination support envisioning the possible in leadership. The second are, what is the poetics of memory? How does imagination support leaders in transforming schools? And then the third is the role of imagination in social justice. And so it's super exciting. And all the tools are outlined in there. There's with appendices. And all the way through, at the end of each chapter, is a sub-chapter called Cultivating Curiosity and Conversation. So it could be used as a book club in a school, in a professional network, where you're actually working with the ideas in the book to develop your own imagination. It should be out in the spring.
Yeah, they're getting very close now, and congratulations on that. It must be very exciting to see that, almost emerging above the horizon, so it becomes a tangible.
I need glasses now, reading all of it, but I'm good.
Yeah. One of the other things that has been a realization in the conversation today, and I think conversation itself for me is one of those undervalued tools of learning. Because we talk all the time, we take talking for granted, but in fact there's one of the major mechanisms of learning and acquisition comes through our own dialogue with ourselves and the processing of dialogue from other people. And one of the most powerful conversations that it's still growing today, and I think that this shows that its value is really high, is coaching. And I think coaching and imagination are intimately linked. And that's, I've been coaching for some time, and that's a new insight for me that, in fact, coaching draws on many of the tools that you're talking about.
It sure does.
So any thoughts about coaching?
Coaching does. Mental health support does. Yes, absolutely. Because these aren't tools specifically for lesson planning. These are tools that are at the heart of the books we most enjoy. They're tools that are at the heart of the games we can't get our teenagers to stop playing. They're tools that are part of the cultures and aspects of culture that engage us. So we need to this is what Kieran Egan's work did, was that he didn't come to this from a neuroscience perspective. He came to it from a cultural anthropological perspective. What are the tools that come along with oral language that have engaged our emotions and imaginations as oral language users, as literate people, and what are the tools of literacy, and what are the tools of theoretical thinking, what are the tools of ironic thinking? Because our imaginations as culture have been transformed. And so indeed, powerful is coaching, powerful in leadership, but right now we've still barely got imagination recognized as incredibly valuable for teaching. So we've got a long way to go in these other capacities. However, with all of the interest in cultivating creativity and innovation and the pressure, and it's one of the 21st century skills, be creative. Well, thinking back to the metaphor, you better pay some attention to imagination and how to get that up in the morning. The good news is we can all do it. More good news is there's specific tools we can use to make it happen. The bad news is it's not going to happen unless we start talking about imagination and fixing and debunking myths that it's not important for leadership.
Yeah. The old soft skills basket, it probably sits at the bottom of that one, doesn't it? We talk about soft skills, and people have begun to realise, I think, quite significantly that these so-called soft skills are way more essential and crucial in a successful modern world that we have. I think probably it's time to throw to this other question. I see Irene doing lots of thinking and lots of processing. I'd love to hear from Miriam and from Oscar, if you feel open to doing so. What do you wonder about imagination in your role, in your current role? Could be as a leader, or in fact, we're all leaders in some form. So anyone willing to sort of engage with this question about what are you wondering at the moment about this, about your own role and how this is connecting to you as a participant in this and triggering some new thinking?
I think Oscar put in a question about how do you see the end goal? How can you have the drive to continue to improve and become the best you? That's a great question. My sense, and from what I understand from my research, is that this all happens in communities that value imagination. If you're surrounded by people that don't take it seriously and they think it's a waste of time and frivolous, it's hard to envision end goals and spend time in that process. But if you're surrounded by people that value imagination and see imagination as at the heart of enacting change in real communities, then you spend time there. So the how is not something I can describe in a sentence or less, but I would say one crucial element is valuing imagination, and secondly, having relationships with people who value it like you do.
Yeah, it's a perfect answer. And to me, what comes to mind is that cognitive ambush that I love as a mechanism for quantum change in approach to thinking. So sometimes you can take people, and you've described this already, take people through a learning experience and then sit back and say, you've been using imagination. And allowing that to sort of, rather than framing the point to begin with, take them through the experience and then reveal, if you like. And that sense of surprise, I think, is a very strong positive emotion and affect that we can use to help energize change. I see that there are probably a couple of ranges of emotion that people go through. One is that, really? And which opens up the possibility of curiosity and further exploration. And then we go into the long-term change, which sometimes is characterized by less positive emotions of, this is a struggle, I'm frustrated with this, but that's a necessary part of learning. And then there's, I'm beginning to get this, and that satisfaction phase where we sort of come through. And I think that surprise that you're helping give today, that sort of insight, I hadn't thought of it like that. That sort of piece is the entry into the time and the effort and the cost of navigating that change. So for me, that's what I love about your work in particular. Oscar, Jen, even Sam, who's on the call as well. Anyone? Any other thoughts about what summary thoughts you're having? Because I'm going to throw to Gillian's last point, which is what the hope she has from here as we wander through into the later phases. But any other comments or thoughts about where you are now in your thinking compared to where you might have been at the start of this conversation?
I'll jump in. In thinking about kind of the conversation that you both just had, how it relates to coaching and how it brings in that energy that sometimes happens during a coaching conversation, where you can feel both people getting excited about what, you as the coach and the coachee. And now I'm seeing that this is it. This is that piece, that line that goes to that conversation, because you're asking them about the possibilities of their work, or you're asking them to tell a story about something that was meaningful to them. So this is, to me, it all just clicked as to where that energy comes from and why that excitement can be felt and the enjoyment. And then my mind goes to, that's what education needs right now, right? That's what our teachers need right now. That's what our leaders, our kids, everybody needs this right now, because we've been struggling the past few years, right? And with everything going on. And I think a lot of educators, leaders have lost their passion for doing this work because of everything going on. And I see this as that, here's our way out, right? Here's or not even our way out, but here's our way to shift and to change, like you're saying, Gillian, like to make the massive change that needs to happen. So
I love what you said. It's beautiful. Two thoughts. One is, in those coaching moments when we want to learn more about somebody's work, so many ways you could use cognitive tools, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. What's your story? But there's all these other ways you could ask them to give you an entry point into that would make them lean in. And that's the somatic expression of imagination. How do we represent imagination with our bodies? A lot of people go, boo. I tend to think of it as leaning in. It's when we lean in because we're now eager or searching for more. In terms of the passion part, we've had, a dozen cohorts, hundreds of students do our master's program, and it's universally that this reinvigorates their teaching. They just they're storytellers, and they're excited to find the story and share the story. And what does it mean? And all of these tools are tools of the storytelling. So it's not just about the students being more engaged, it's about the teachers being more engaged too. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I've got thoughts happening left, right, and centre. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I just want to give others a chance. I see, Irene, that you're throwing some lovely emoticons in there. Just any thoughts from you, Irene, about where we've gone to from today?
It's just wow, lots like I like how you concretize, Gillian, like imagination for us and put it back on to the earth and on the soil, because it's true what imagination does, and it's like, and the purpose of it, and sometimes that's just what we need, because imagination is just so hard to define. Comparing it to what we see is like helps us make more sense out of it, and that was really helpful to me.
I agree. I've been at this a few years now, and I just get more and more interested as I go along. But yeah, so maybe I could conclude with my hope. I said we had three questions, two unusual things. One is that imagination is like soil, and two is that it's very practical and we can cultivate it. My hope is that those people here today, Miriam, Irene, Sam, Oscar, you might want to do the course, connect with me, work together to actually develop those skills, and maybe partake in some other professional development. My goal overall is that we, as educators and leaders around the world, can change the way we talk about leadership so that in 5 years, 10 years time, people are talking about imagination. Because Andrew's right, there's very few bits of research. There's very few people that are intentionally studying the role of imagination in leadership, and even fewer in educational leadership. So it's my hope that we can change that. And if you're interested, and if you're on the EduSpark platform, you could join the course and we could keep learning together.
Yeah, just posting those links now. And for anyone listening to this live, or in fact watching the recording, and if you're in here as a free user, inside the course that we're in now, this summer series course, at the top of this there's a form that you can fill in to get access to Pro as a trial, and that gives you a chance to hop into both of these courses, which are Pro level courses. So if that's something that interests you, please complete that form or reach out to us. One of the things that I can't help myself, I've just got to come back to, you talk about not being able to measure stuff. You know, one of the patterns that I have in coaching is someone says, I'd just like to be more confident. So how would you rate your confidence now? What rating do you need to have? So there's the gap identification. Now imagine, and this is exactly the wording is, imagine you are at, let's say they say an 8. Imagine you're at an 8. Tell me what you see that's different to your 3. So, pardon me, we're actually taking people into, there's an example of a real coaching tool that many people use, it's not uniquely mine, that allows them to tell a story of the future. And through that, sometimes people will say, I just want to feel like I was when I'm 20. And there's a goal that emerges which just crystallizes and sparkles because it captures the emotion. And that's the thing that you hold them to. In terms of talking about Oscar's goal setting, the goal can't be, I want to be 8 out of 10 with my confidence. That's not a goal. It's a measurement. But when we start to tell story, and as a person who can listen to that story, you crystallize the gems that pop and say, what do you think about that statement? That becomes the statement they put on the fridge and they look at every day or on a sticky note and say, that's where I want to be. And so it's that captivation, or captivating the emotional component of a desire for the future, that's articulated in something that's crystallized, or in a manner that is memorable, which to me speaks about everything in a practical sense as a coach that you've been talking about today. So,
if we take your example there and we apply the lens of imaginative education, or if we look at cognitive tools, we've got emotional response with the body's tools of imagination. We've got the story form, we've got vivid mental imagery, and we've got a change of context. We've got at least 4 cognitive tools working. So what does this add to your practice of coaching? Maybe it explains why these practices work. And then if it isn't working as well, let's go back to the cognitive tools, see what else we can use. So maybe we could get some of your coaching colleagues involved and think about how these fields of work overlap.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely untapped area of exploration in the field of coaching, which is itself a very successful domain. It's been around for a number of years now, and it continues to grow, and people inherently know it has value. You don't have to sell coaching. When people have experienced it, they want more of it. And why? I think because it's actually tapping into all of the mechanisms that you're talking about. And that's my big, I've been working with you in the creation of your work on EduSpark for some time. And every time I talk to you, there's a new insight that I have, which is why I value our conversations so much. So that's one of the things I'd love to talk to you more about in terms of how that might apply in a field that is about education, but is actually not typically seen as a part of education. It's also a field of leadership. Coaching leaders are usually very strongly relational leaders, because there's that sense of cognitive intimacy that forms in a one-to-one relationship for coaching. That means that people open up way more to these mechanisms of imagination and become more vulnerable and more trusting. So, love to just give the opportunity. I sort of feel a bit guilty in these sessions because I tend to talk too much because I'm so excited about things. Miriam, Oscar, Irene in particular, Sam and Jen, any comments or thoughts or questions as we move towards a close?
Yeah, so I started my little toolkit. That's the imagination soil, and there's a plant growing, and I've written, I'm going to tell a story. My favorite question in class always is, and even when I'm collaborating, is to say, what if, and just take it from there. So thank you for this, and it's been definitely a topic worth exploring. And I think it really helps also if you have very collaborative leadership who's open to your ideas and colleagues, so you're not always working in a vacuum. That it's not just you and your kids, it's involving the parents as well as the leadership and everyone. They all have to be on board for this to really go through. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks, Miriam. Yeah, lovely comments. Jen, Irene, Oscar, Sam, any other closing summary thoughts where your brain might be now and where it's been taken to in this fabulous short journey with Gillian?
I'd just like to say thank you for opening this possibility up to us.
Oh, thanks,
that
Irene.
That imagination is not just for kids, and that we just continue playing with life, and we will get there, and we will be successful, just like you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Fabulous comments, and thank you for joining today. Jen, what are your final thoughts?
I was just thinking, kind of similar to what Irene said, I want to say thank you for opening my mind in this conversation, and then thinking about, for myself, how this looks for me as an instructional coach, as a course or an instructional designer supporting creators, or even me as a parent, and what this looks like with my own children and how I'm interacting with them. So I have a lot to think about. I'm really excited to go dig into your course and explore a little deeper, and hopefully continue these conversations, because I'm very intrigued, especially on the coaching aspect too, and how it all fits together.
I'd love to work with you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And a final comment about that: we are very close to the updated release of Community. And I see this as being a real community of practice, and it's been a tool that I've been waiting for some time as a functional tool within EduSpark to continue asynchronous conversation. And we're very keen to move beyond just a static marketplace of courses into this sort of more active live space as well as asynchronous conversation space. So that's a mechanism that we'll be employing a lot, Gillian, when in your courses in particular, to get things moving. So with that, folks, thank you everyone for joining. This is, we'll place this recording into the platform. We do have other people coming along in the coming weeks. Usually there's a cadence of one a week. Thanks very much, Irene. I really appreciate you joining today, and hopefully New Zealand's not too cold down there. So it's much warmer where I am, and I think where Gillian is, although I think the world is probably getting a little bit too warm, as we all know. So yeah. But thank you, everyone, and especially huge thanks to Gillian. I really love the way that your work is grounded in research. There are lots of great ideas out there, but they just don't have the rigour behind them, and you have this fabulous academic rigour behind this that I think really shows this as a body of work to be taken notice of. We'd love to continue to play a small role in promoting that in and beyond the world that you might have reached to. And it's something that I continually refer back to when I'm talking to people in terms of the impact that this and your work can have in raising the game for humanity. I mean, that's a fairly big statement. We've got some massive problems to solve, and I think we need some good imagination to solve them. So thank you very much. Closing words from you, Gillian?
Just thank you. And I hope we can work together and explore and develop our imagination. I'll make sure Andrew sends out any upcoming opportunities to learn more.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Gillian. Take care and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you so much, everybody.
And we shall talk to you all very soon, hopefully. Thanks again. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.